I never had the opportunity to be a normal kid. That was just not on the table for me. And so I've had to like figure out a way to be the abnormal kid. The way I dress, the way I relate to people, projects that I take on, they're all trying to kind of make sense of being a bit of an oddity to others, but make that a good thing rather than a negative thing. And I suddenly was like, oh God, architecture can be so much more than fancy houses and skyscrapers. It can really enrich community life. It can enrich society. I'm just always looking for opportunities where I can connect social issues with all my architectural knowledge and expertise and connections and do something useful. When I was feeling very, very low and like the flat was a complete mess, stuff everywhere, some of my neighbours who had a key came in and just tidied it up a bit while I was out. And that's very special. I remember that just for the rest of my life, I think.
Hi, Phin.
Hi.
Thanks so much for doing this, and thanks for having us in your very beautiful flat.
You're very welcome.
Where did you grow up, first of all?
I grew up in the Midlands, in a small village outside a small town. The town was called Banbury. It's like the most southern tip of the Midlands before you start heading up towards Birmingham.
Okay.
I'm not by birth a city boy, city guy, city person. I think there was a sheep field opposite the house where I spent the first part of my life. But then I moved to quite a horrible Taylor Wimpey new build estate as a sort of young teenager and spent my kind of like coming of age formative years in that estate, which was like on the edge of Warwick, one of these like very generic towns, new build estates that you see all over England, where just like some big volume house builder just like rolls out like roughly the same thing they did last time, all kind of 2-story, not particularly well built, boxy houses strangled by cars. And so I think kind of maybe the contrast between those two like childhood homes was quite stark to me.
Yeah. So tell me a bit more about the first one then, the early one.
Well, the first one was like a really old stone building, like really thick walls, had like a decent garden. It was in a village, part of like a historic terrace where each of the like different houses in the terrace were like different style, maybe built at a different era. Next door neighbours was thatched, which was really interesting. And then there's like a bit of the village that's like a more modern council estate, and there's a bit of the village that's like quite grand and has these sort of bigger houses. It's a lot of variety, and you can walk everywhere. You can walk and cycle everywhere, and I'd cycle into town or get the bus or something. And then moving to Warwick, which I thought was like, all right, we're coming into the big city. This is a big town now. This is a proper place. I'm not stuck in my little backwater village anymore. But actually, that estate that I was in, everything was kind of the same. Like all the buildings looked the same. Everyone had the same car. And that's how it felt, as a kind of, 13, 14-year-old. And I had so much less freedom as a child, just at that like young teenage age when you're like craving freedom and independence. Actually, something about not my house exactly, but like the estate that my house was part of was giving me the exact opposite, that like you were really dependent on people giving you lifts around, because like it wasn't so hard to walk around and cycle around, and the bus connections into town were really expensive and infrequent and all this kind of stuff. So I think about that estate a lot, and how I learned what not to do as a housing designer or as an architect, and also like what I look for when I'm thinking about moving. Like, what kind of place do I want to live? What kind of place would I advise others to go and live in? And I'd say avoid those kind of Taylor Wimpey, Barratt Home, Persimmon, edge of town, new build estates, because they're quite draining to live in, I think. I'm sure some people like them.
Draining is an interesting word. So in what way are they draining? Why would you say that?
Well, as a kid, like there was just nowhere to play. Like there was like this tiny little, like the size of a small car playground.
Okay.
And that was kind of it. And everywhere is a road. Whereas when I was in the village, like you could play in the churchyard, you could play in the field, you could play in the little forest bit, you could play at the quite substantial park next to the quite substantial primary school. And then moving into the new build estate, like all of that went away, and you become much more reliant on parents with vehicles. And then as an older person, once I was like 18, I was able to go drinking. There weren't any pubs either. Like there was no kind of adult social infrastructure either. So people would they'd have to kind of leave their neighborhood to see their friends or to experience culture or anything. Whereas even in that little village, there was a pub, there was a shop, there was like a little social life to it. It was in a tiny place, but like had somehow more going on than that estate on the edge of town in Warwick in the Midlands.
So interesting.
Yeah.
So what precipitated the move from one to the other then?
I think it was partly that my parents wanted us all to have our own bedroom. I'm one of 4 kids, and we were all getting to the age where like sharing a bedroom was a bit of a stretch. And they realized that they had enough money that if they moved to a new build estate with smaller rooms, then everyone could have their own room. Because at that point, one of my sisters was sleeping in a bathroom. Like they'd put a board over the bath, turned it into a bed, and that was her bedroom. So she had like a toilet and a sink and a bath in her bedroom, which was kind of great for her because like she wanted her own room, and it was better to have a small weird room with a toilet in it than no bedroom, or like to share a bedroom. But I think that was a big part of the move anyway, was like, give each of these 4 children their own little space rather than making one of them sleep on top of a bath.
I suppose it's fair enough.
It's also like, my dad was a secondary school teacher, and to some extent you have to go where the teaching jobs are.
Okay.
It wasn't that far. It's just like half an hour up the M40 or something.
So did you have your own room in the early house though, or were you sharing?
Yeah, well, I'm the eldest of the 4. So
okay.
I was like, why do we have to move? I've got my own room. But yeah, my sisters were, I think, increasingly, they're the youngest of the 4, and they were feeling the pressure.
Okay, so is it 2 boys, 2 girls, was it? Or
well, I'm non-binary.
Okay.
So I don't identify as a boy, but I did back then. So it was 2 boys and 2 girls, and the girls are twins.
Okay.
I've always been very effeminate and not very comfortable with gender categories like that. But my younger brother, Joss, had his own bedroom, and then my sisters were like, oh gosh, one of us will have to sleep in a bath.
So when did you start thinking about gender in that way then? Quite a young age?
Yeah, really young age. Like my parents, very flawed in many ways, but also kind of amazing in many ways, like a lot of people's parents. And they always allowed me to play with any kind of toy. So I had Barbies and Cindy's and Polly Pockets. Loved Polly Pockets. These like little worlds where you got like Polly moves around, and it's like it folds up into kind of the shape of a clam or something. Some parents would be very uncomfortable with their like new baby son enjoying the color pink or enjoying playing with these like girl coded toys. But my parents were totally fine with that. And so I think that was part of it. And, gradually you get more indoctrinated into gender as you get older, and you become influenced by society and friends and marketing and all of this stuff. And I probably moved from Polly Pockets to Mighty Maxes, which is like the boy version of Polly Pocket. But I think it probably started then that like I've always seen gender as like kind of fluid and like a little bit silly and like an opportunity to have some fun and express yourself in a way that feels, more true to you than what society thinks people with your type of body should do, say, and look like.
Mm-hmm. Looking back on it, how do you think that your home either supported or constrained that feeling that you were having?
These 2 childhood homes, I guess they were different. They were positive in some ways and they were both negative in some ways. The village house had like weird nooks and corners. There was like, I think there was a bit that used to be maybe like a bread oven or something that was just kind of used as a cupboard. But when I was really little, I could get in it. Like I could climb through this little hole in the big stone wall. And it also had a like fairly generous garden, 200 square meters or something. And I was able to inhabit different corners of the garden at different times, different ways. And so there was lots of like places to escape to and hide and make little worlds. And then the new build house in Warwick didn't have any of that. tiny garden, kind of nowhere to hide, but I had my own room. And maybe because it was a new build and my parents like were kind of compensating for the fact that we suddenly had much smaller bedrooms, they let me paint my own wall. And so I got friends round and we like turned it into this like kind of crazy elaborate mural with like different paintings by different people, that was actually quite successful. Like, it sounds like it's going to be terrible to let a teenager do that, but I think I had enough like artistically thoughtful friends that we came up with something quite beautiful. And so I guess that was a way to, I don't know, like I had a huge multicolored butterfly that my friend Verity had painted on the wall above my bed, which is not a sort of typical thing for like a teenage boy to have painted on their wall. You know, I wasn't having like football posters or page 3 girls. It was like, yeah, multicolored butterflies. But I guess the house made that possible in the sense that like my parents were unprecious enough about it that they were like, yeah, Finn, you can paint this however you like. We're not going to like dictate how you relate to the like the fabric of the building in that way.
That's fantastic, isn't it? Good for them. Tell me about your mum then.
Mum is from Stockport. She's from a long line of sort of farming community in the north, and she trained as a teacher, which is how she met my dad. And then she's now like does lots of things. She's a therapist. She's been a librarian. She's published some children's fiction. She's taught drama. She taught English. She home educated the 4 of us. I was home educated until I was 15, I think. My siblings all started school when they were about 13. And she, you know, my parents shared it out before they divorced, but she did I think the lion's share of that labor. Yeah, she's a very impressive, interesting person, I think. You know, parents are complicated and we have complicated relationships with them as we get older, but like she's definitely impressive.
So homeschooling is quite a big thing, isn't it? All the way up to that age as well. That's very formative. So how do you look back on that? What did you take from it and what was the downside maybe?
Yeah, homeschooling is an incredible thing. Lots of people end up homeschooled because they go to school and they get bullied so hard that they have to leave. And that's a lot of people's route into home ed. But we were home educated from the start. I think that's because my parents were both quite socially conscious teachers. They're both trained as teachers, and they could see the changes coming in the like rise of standardized testing, the rise of like the national curriculum, and they were a bit skeptical about all of that stuff. And so when they had kids, they clearly had a conversation like, you know, we're teachers, maybe we could teach these people ourselves. But it was hugely formative. It's hard to compare to what normal people experience, because for me it was normal, you know, like it's all I knew for a long time. The downsides that people assume are like, well, how do you make friends? But actually, there's loads of home ed people dotted around. So you can make friends with local home ed families. And you also join youth groups. You join like the local, on a cricket team or something. But I joined Woodcraft Folk, which is a sort of long-standing sort of socialist alternative to Scouts and Guides. Has groups all over the country, including in the Midlands. And so I'd make a lot of friends through that, but also through like Sunday school and just in the village, like friends in the village. So the downsides I started to experience, and the reason I actually went to school, were more to do with things like I'd like to have a go on a bandsaw. I'd like to like use these facilities that I don't have at home. I'd like to learn drama. You know, I wanted to put on little plays with people and do those kind of activities that it's harder to do in a living room or in a kitchen. But actually, socialization, I think that was a real positive side of home ed, because you meet all sorts of weirdos. Like, there's just so many different kinds of people end up in home ed, and you relate to them in a much more open, uninhibited way. Whereas when I did go to school, I was really struck by how like narrow the kind of framework for social opportunities became.
That's interesting. So actually, the the fact that you were homeschooled, it sounds like, and had what sounds like pretty open-minded, liberal-minded parents, allowed you to be whoever you wanted to be in a way that maybe you couldn't have been at school, do you think? Is that fair?
Well, it's hard to know, isn't it? Because, on the one hand, my parents were like kind of radicals. On the other hand, they were like deeply Christian and very strict.
Okay.
So there was a sort of odd contradiction going on there at times. But I think they were, for all of their strictness, they were also interested in individuality as a valuable tool. They liked that we weren't getting dressed up in uniforms, and they liked that were able to be more creative and do more adventurous things than we would have been able to do if we were in school. So they don't teach. My parents didn't teach by subject. They preferred to teach by theme. And so you do a whole project on the Tudors, and within that you do costume and making clothes, but you also do cookery, and you also do music, and you also do a bit of architecture, and then you'd go and look at some museums, and like through the frame of the Tudors, you would explore all of these different subjects. Whereas schools are much more interested in, now you're doing maths, now you're doing English, now you're doing religious education, and everything gets kind of segmented into these compartments.
So you mentioned that your parents got divorced.
Yeah.
How old were you then?
Yeah, I feel like home educating 4 children probably is enough to push anyone over the edge of divorce. No, they got divorced when I was like 18, I guess.
Okay.
It was just as I was going to university. I studied architecture in Cardiff, and it was around then. And they're still in touch. They still meet up like once a year and play a board game. And it's definitely one of those divorces that you're like, yeah, in retrospect, that was the right call. Good for them.
Okay, so how did you experience it sort of just around the home? Because obviously this being the theme of the home, those kind of things, they can obviously set the atmosphere of a place. So how did you feel it, as it were?
Yeah, well, it was, this feels like we're moving into like therapy territory, which is possibly a good thing. But there was quite a lot of stress at home. They were very quick to stress out about small things going wrong. Mum's forgotten her glasses, so how are we going to get to church on time? Or like a tiny thing that other parents would have like, brushed under the rug, or like wouldn't have panicked about, became like big dramas in my household. And I still feel that now as an adult, that like I hate small things going wrong. It really I really feel it in a way that I'm aware peers and friends don't. And I think that's because I've like learned that behavior, and I'm psychoanalyzing a little bit, but I sort of wonder if to some extent that behavior was because they didn't have such a deep physical connection. Like they often slept in separate beds or went to bed at very different times, and I just thought that was normal. How would you know otherwise? But really, what I think in retrospect you learn is like they're just not. They loved each other in many ways, and they were like a great team in many ways. But I don't think they had that like depth of physical intimacy and connection that lays the foundations for weathering the stress of small things going wrong, like someone can't find their glasses on time to go to church. And now that they're separated, and my mum has a great Quaker boyfriend, like she's so much kind of calmer and more easygoing, and I'm like, oh, I wonder.
Yeah.
I sort of see where this comes from now.
Yeah.
And so the lesson for all of us is to like identify the behaviors that we struggle with as adults, figure out how they are rooted in things that we've learned from our parents, and then figure out whether we want to continue those behaviors or change them, I guess.
So have you quite consciously tried to move away from those, or why do you say that?
Yeah, I try really hard now I was living with an ex, and she just wouldn't get stressed when small things go wrong. She was like, oh, well, never mind. That is annoying, but like, we'll figure it out. And so I've tried to like adopt that more into my life, and it's hard. I feel that like, if I was to knock over a plant pot and spill earth all over the floor, in the past if I was still like operating with my parent brain, I'd be like, oh no, what a disaster. This is I'm going to be late for my date or whatever. And I'd sort of shout and stress. But now I try to be like, oh, well, I'll sweep it up, put it in the bin and get on with my day. Like, it's really not the end of the world. But I have to try to do that. Like, that doesn't come naturally to me.
There's a quote, I think it's Charles Bukowski, maybe. There's a quote which is, life is a series of small tragedies, which I really like. And I think it's so true, though, in that when it comes to the home, well, actually, they're also, Rangan Chatterjee calls them micro stress doses, right? But we have these micro stresses from the moment we wake up, which is, I don't know, like you haven't replaced the loo roll on the loo roll holder.
Mm-hmm.
You realise that the light bulb's burned out. The door handle is a bit wobbly, and so on and so forth. We all have these tiny things that just disrupt our flow as we go through the day, and they do accumulate. And I think if you're someone that feels them because you've been brought up in that environment, it's interesting. I think they do have an effect for sure.
Yeah, we do this thing that I think was my parents were quite interested in discipline and quite interested in like rewards and incentives. And every day, at the end of the day, we would have up to 6 sweeties, like 6 Skittles or whatever. And they would deduct sweeties based on things we'd done wrong earlier in the day. So in their head, this was like a nice incentive to behave well. But we experienced it as like every single day ends with a kind of accounting for every tiny thing that went wrong during that 12-hour period, and then being punished for it then, like at the end of the day. And it would be, tiny things like, oh, well, you slammed a door this morning, so we're going to take a sweetie away for that. And then you used a swear word, like around lunchtime, so we'll take 2 sweeties away from that. And it made us all, I think, over focus on small things going wrong, rather than there was no way to earn more sweeties. Like it wasn't like you were rewarded for the good things you did in the day. You were like retrospectively punished for the bad things that had happened. Which, if anyone's listening to has young children, don't use that system. It messes people up. Reward good behavior.
Has it made you a perfectionist then, do you think?
No, not at all, because like there is no reward for good things, but it definitely makes me very alarmed by mistakes and getting things wrong. Like I hold myself to high standards, and I always have. And that comes from my parents. Like I did my maths A levels 5 years early, sort of insane thing to do. Because you're home educated, you can like move at a faster speed than school kids can. But I don't think I'm a perfectionist, but I am a bit pushy sometimes with myself.
Yeah. I always think it's interesting to dwell on someone's childhood because obviously it tells us so much about who they've become. I mean, you've talked about the divorce there, and thanks for sharing that. It's really, really fascinating, I think. Was there anything else in your childhood that you sort of, some form of adversity you had to deal with, or something you look back on now and think, God, that was so formative, that we haven't talked about yet?
Well, I don't know about adversity. I mean, I was obviously like the weirdo from a young age because I didn't go to school. And so like that marked me out among certainly like peers in the village or in Warwick. And then because I was like racing through the maths curriculum and to some extent other sciences, when I was going into school, it was to sit exams in an exam hall. But I'd be like 11, surrounded by 16-year-olds. And that would mark me out as an even more of a weirdo. So like, even when I was going into school, the people who were my age saw me as like this oddball who was like taking some lessons with the sixth formers. And the sixth formers would see me as this oddball because I was a child compared to them. And yet I was somehow in their like further maths mechanics class or something. So it's not really an adversity, but I never had the opportunity to be a normal kid. That was just like not on the table for me, mostly because of the decisions my parents made. And so I've had to like figure out a way to be the abnormal kid and make that a good quality. Like, and I think that bleeds through into a lot of what I do, the way I dress, the way I relate to people, the kind of work that I take on, the projects that I take on. they're all trying to kind of make sense of being like a bit of an oddity to others, but make that a good thing rather than a negative thing.
Yeah, that makes so much sense, actually. How did that manifest itself, that feeling? I mean, did people make you feel like that? Or do you think that was just something you felt internally? Did you struggle with bullies or anything like that? Yeah.
Yeah, like bullying wasn't great.
But how were you coming across those people if you weren't at school? Or do you mean when you were a
you'd
teenager?
meet them in the village, like, they knew where we lived. They if you went to the park or the skate park or whatever, they could find you. And my brother, I think he's a bit younger than me, he clearly realized early on that he wanted to be more normal. Like, he's a very impressive and interesting guy in many ways, but like from a young age, he was like, I'm not going to do what Finn's doing. I'm going to learn how to skateboard. I'm going to dress like everyone else dresses, and I'll be cool within the framework of like how normal people experience cool, rather than Finn trying to like be cool in some totally bizarre, non-normative manner. And I was always a bit jealous in some ways that he could like chill with the kids that I could not chill with, because if I was to like be part of that social scene, they'd just like, they'd reject me or they'd bully me. But I was able to find other oddballs. I made friends with the weirdos and the freaks and the geeks, and he made friends with like the skaters and the townies and the jocks, and that's fine. Different people are different, I guess. When we did all end up at school, we were all at different schools, and I remember some like dad of a teenage girlfriend being like, "Why are you all at different schools?" I was like, well, we're all different people.
Yeah.
And that really took the wind out of his sails. I think he was trying to be like a bit prickly. I was like, no, you're the moron. You're sending all your 3 completely different daughters to the same school. But I think that just reflects how we, like, the 4 of us kind of pushed ourselves in different directions based on what we perceived each other to be struggling with in our various lanes.
Yeah. Yeah, I really like what you said about making your point of difference into a strength. And you really stand out, I think, in the architecture community from that standpoint, because it is in some ways quite a traditionally minded place. And then suddenly you've got Finn wearing a skirt, like challenging all of our preconceptions about that industry, I feel, in a really fantastic way.
Thank you.
How did you get into architecture? Because obviously, you've described growing up on a very standard, not well-designed estate. How did that sort of spur you on into architecture?
I went to live in Nigeria for a little bit when I was 18. I got a sort of place on this program that the British Council was running, where you worked with a group of young people from another country, first in your own country and then in their country. So I was partnered with a group of Nigerians, and we went and worked in the Rhondda Valley in South Wales, and then we went and worked in Kano in the north of Nigeria. And this was like big year-long project. And while I was in Kano, in the British Council Library, I found a copy of the Architectural Review, which is this, quite established international architecture magazine. And I'd always thought architecture was like skyscrapers and posh houses. That's sort of my dumb childlike conception of what architecture was. And then I was reading this issue of the AR, which happened to be a special issue on the Aga Khan Awards, which are awards specifically for architecture in the Muslim world, and have always had a really deep interest in socially purposeful architecture. So there would be like a refurbishment of a historic marketplace in Marrakesh, or there'd be a small mosque somewhere in Bangladesh that's just like very beautiful or something. Or like, I don't know, a toilet infrastructure upgrade in like in Kano, maybe like a sort of a big city. And I suddenly was like, oh God, architecture can be so much more than fancy houses and skyscrapers. It can like really enrich community life. It can enrich society. It can like be environmentally responsible and socially purposeful. And so I then went and studied architecture at Cardiff University, which had a particularly good reputation at the time for ecological design. But it was like, I had already been interested in design, interested in architecture. I was particularly interested in product design, I think, originally. And then reading this issue of the AR really like transformed my perspective on what architecture could be.
Well, let's talk about this flat. So we're on the Vanbrugh Park estate in SE3.
Yeah.
Designed by Chamberlin, Powell and Bon. So the same architects who designed the Barbican estate and the Golden Lane estate in the City of London. This is much more modest than that, built as council housing. I'd just love to know from your standpoint, why do you think that this place that you live in is an engaging, valuable place to be? Like, how would you in some ways put the case for someone listening who might think, it just looks like a council block, any old council block?
How would I make the case? Well, okay, so like, I think good, well-funded, well-maintained public housing is an inherent good. It is inherently good that people of all backgrounds can afford to live in places where they can work and send their kids to school and put down roots and form connections. And but obviously there's a spectrum within public housing from less well-designed to more well-designed. And I feel very lucky to live somewhere that I think is very well-designed. And the thing that is well-designed about it is the way that it fosters a community. So there's lots of little pockets of green space and open space around the estate where neighbours can meet and children can play. There's 2 pedestrian routes that go through it. There's 11 pedestrian ways in to it. The flats like my flat have like little spaces out front where you bump into your immediate next door neighbours. And it has just been designed around an idea of social life. There used to be a little laundrette. There used to be 2 laundry areas. The laundry areas are still there. You can still dry clothes outside. The laundrette sadly closed by the GLC back in the day. But that generosity of having enough space to meet and hang out with neighbours means that you can do things like have an Easter party or the summer party. You know, we'll have a summer party on the 21st and there'll be like a tombola. People will bring food out. There'll be like some music. We're going to put up a maypole. You can't do any of that stuff if you don't have space to do it. Like, you need the space first in order to enable any of that community life to kind of flourish. And so what I'd say about this estate is like, it's not really about, how it looks from the outside. It's like how it works from the inside, both like how the flat works, how individual homes relate to the outdoors and relate to their neighbours, but also how the kind of estate as a mini community works and the opportunities that it gives you as a resident to do things with your neighbours is a really key part of why this is better than that new build estate that I grew up in the Midlands, which had, almost no community space or community facilities at all.
A quick interlude to let you know that there's a house tour to accompany this episode, which is available to insiders on Patreon. Here's a short preview. You would string your washing line between these big stumps, hang your clothes out. No one was really using it for laundry, and so we thought, why not make it into a grapevine? So the plan is that these will grow up, and then we'll have horizontal wires. But yeah, the idea is that these will eventually form a kind of green pergola. How lovely. That we could have like a long table and maybe like a big dinner or something underneath this shady canopy. This is the kind of the best bit where we've managed to extend people's front gardens. Yeah. So all along here, when I arrived, they didn't have green at the front. They had back gardens, but they didn't have little front gardens. Great poppies. This place is great. Look at all these bees. This is so beautiful. I love it.
And it was just like either no planting at all, or like paving, or like just grass.
Yeah.
None of these trees were here. So it looks good now, but like imagine in sort of 20 years' time, these will be like really mature.
Yeah.
It'll be a very special corner of the estate.
I was reading some of your writing, and you've talked about something called unlocking. So on the subject of neighbours, you sometimes come together to celebrate unlocking. So tell us about what that means and what you do.
Yeah, unlocking is an idea from the American science fiction writer Kurt Vonnegut. He writes this piece. First, it appears in Cracked Cradle, which is one of his books, and then he talks about it again in a speech where he argues that really, for our climate, our microclimate, we should have 6 seasons, not 4. And we should match the language of those 6 seasons more closely to our actual experience of the weather across those months. And if we did this, maybe we'd be a bit less depressed, because he thinks we have sort of false expectations. We call March and April spring. March and April are often horrible. They're like cold and wet and grey, and they're not that springy, actually. And they're even less springy if you're like slightly further north in the hemisphere. And similarly, like we call September, October, and November autumn, while, November's actually like really quite grim. So he suggests, let's have 6 seasons, and you have locking, which is November and December, which is like, it's really cold, it's dark, but like it's not quite as like crunchy and warm as autumn was. But it's not yet deep winter either. And then deep winter is just January and February, really cold, really icy, really dark. And then you have March and April become unlocking, which is like, it's not quite spring, don't get too excited, but like you can see the daffodils coming up. It's not quite as grim as it was during February. And so I have started, I think for like 5-6 years, every March, I will have an unlocking party where it might be big, might be small, but we will mark the arrival of unlocking by planting something, because it's a good time of year to plant a lot of things, and eating rhubarb, which is a sort of seasonal kind of late February, early March fruit. So I'll make like a big batch of rhubarb ice cream. We'll have this little ceremony. We plant a tree or plant something. And often they're like quite big parties. And we've done a few on the estate where we've had like 200 people around, and we like all plant a tree together and read out this little bit of Vonnegut. And I guess I feel like we're losing cultural rituals in modern British life. Like people aren't getting married as much, and that's fine. Like I respect that, but also like those weddings did play a key role in like giving a kind of joyful ritual structure to our years. And we don't go to church or to mosque as much as like people used to. And so you lose all of the sort of ceremony and ritual that comes with that. And so finding new secular traditions that can have a ritual attached to them, or at least give you an excuse to like get some friends around and have a big dinner, I think is really important. I really like Burns Night, for example. It's not an English festival, it's a Scottish festival, but I'll always note it and celebrate it because it feels like a good, relatively new invention that has a kind of cultural value that I appreciate.
You just want to wear a kilt.
I do like wearing kilts, but I also like eating haggis and dancing ceilidhs. And like, Burns Night was only invented after Burns died. It was like his friends suggested that they do it to like commemorate him. And it's become this like national thing in Scotland, but even like down here, people will celebrate Burns Night. And I think that's great. I think more people should be inventing traditions like that.
Oh, I totally agree. I love rituals. That is such a great idea. I really like it. When I spoke to Catherine May, she talked about, if you're an introvert or you're neurodivergent in some way, you perhaps don't love being in big groups of people. Maybe New Year's Eve isn't kind of your thing.
Yeah.
So she celebrates the solstice, and she does it in quite a low-key way because it's somehow more in rhythm with nature rather than with anything else. And I love that idea of, your rhubarb thing, celebrating rhubarb during the unlocking. It's really lovely. You also you were showing me earlier, there's areas where you've got together with the locals and you've planted stuff. You've taken up the paving stones that exist between the various blocks here,
Yeah.
and you've turned them into flower beds.
Yeah.
Tell us about that process. How did that come about?
Well, it starts off with a fight because I live in Greenwich, and Greenwich Council are the freeholder of the estate. And one day they decided they wanted us to get rid of all the small front gardens from these raised flats. There's three blocks of these raised flats. And they just came along and they sent a bunch of men who they literally started trying to take people's benches and plant pots away from these little kind of nooks that we all have outside of our homes. And this was very scary. Like, I love my flat, but so much of what I love about it is to do with this little threshold into the public realm, and that being a space where I can have some plants, dry my laundry, talk to my neighbours. I feel like if that was to go, it would massively kind of dissolve the qualities of what I like about living on this row. And so we fought them really hard. Also, they had no basis at all for this. There was nothing in the building regulations, no fire engineer, or no one could find a good reason to justify why they were taking away these plant pots. They just decided one day that it was a fire risk without any evidence or professional expertise, and were pursuing that course of action. And so we fought them in the media. We got multiple Grenfell Tower fire expert witnesses to come and look at the situation. We got the fire brigade to look at the situation. Started a petition that got 40,000 signatures. And I end up on BBC telly and various radio shows talking about this. And we kind of win. The council eventually, they never formally apologized, but they stopped pursuing the
men stopped coming around.
The men stopped coming to take the plant pots, and they haven't come back. And then they started repaving the estate. And I think that was to get us to calm down. They'd been really spooked by this community who'd suddenly fought back with more vigor than they'd encountered before. And they were thinking of something that they could just do to make the neighbours happy and get us to kind of appreciate them more after this big fight. So they started repaving the estate, or relaying the existing paving stones. And so we just said to them, hey, given that you're taking up all the paving stones and laying them again, please can you put in a bunch more flower beds? We've already done the community consultation with all the neighbours to know where these new flower beds should be. Here's a set of architectural drawings. Please do this. And they did, sort of miraculously. So they did the work of not planting the flower beds, but taking up the paving stones for us. And then we planted all of those flower beds, or the gardening club planted all those flower beds. So somehow this effort, local authority effort to make the estate less green, actually has turned into the exact opposite, where there's way more flowers and there's way more planting going on now than there was when I started.
It's just fantastic. And you were showing me there's these huge posts where people would supposedly hang their laundry out, but sort of don't get used like that. So you decided to plant vines up them instead.
Yeah, there's two laundry areas, neither of which are used very much for laundry. A lot of people dry their laundry at home these days. One of them gets used a lot by children playing. They drive their scooters around or play football. But the other one was just sort of sitting there. People would sometimes wash their cars, but it was a bit of dead space. And it had these big wooden posts with big metal rings attached to them. So it looks quite striking. And so I thought, what if we grew a vineyard on these posts? So we've grown these little vines. They're not so little anymore. They're, as tall as the posts are. And we've only done 8 of the 16 posts so far. I'm sort of hoping we'll get more neighbours on board in the future and we can have a few more. But eventually that is going to be a green tunnel. We had maybe sort of 100 grapes last year. This year we might have several hundred. We can even make wine, perhaps.
Yeah.
We've specified Vitis Regent, which is a type of grape that you can make wine from, or you can just eat off the vine.
Okay.
So we have our options. We have various options.
Yeah.
But I really like it as an example of a community taking a bit of underused infrastructure and improving it, and hopefully, vines are quite slow growing, but in a few years' time, that would be a really magical sort of tunnel where you could have a big dinner or you could imagine kind of children playing and running through the tunnel or something like that.
It's fantastic. And it brings me back to that word belonging again, because I think we all have a sort of collective responsibility to generate that kind of feeling, right? I think that's what you've successfully done here. So I really admire it. I'd love to just quickly pivot to this idea of repair, because I know this is another thing that you're interested in. I mean, I'm looking at this lamp across from us here that looks like it's been repaired in some way, but just tell me about repair in this flat, first of all.
Yeah, so it's part of my, like, I guess, theoretical architectural advocacy is I've been writing and thinking much more about repair over the years. We're very bad at repairing things in Britain. We tend to just throw stuff away quite easily. But we've got better. We've got better. We're less of a disposable culture than we used to be, and we now have examples of like high street shops like Toast or Patagonia offering repair services for their garments, and the EU is going to make it so technology companies have to offer repair services for phones and washing machines and stuff. So like there's some improvements. Like we know that repair is better for the planet, and we are gradually moving in that direction. But when it comes to architecture and buildings and housing in particular, we're terrible at repair. So there's so many examples of housing estates that have just been left to kind of rot and then eventually get knocked down and gentrified, or some sort of crap thing comes and replaces them. My own sister's estate in Elephant and Castle, like the council's been knocking that down for decades, really. Like, her block is still there, but like many of her neighbours' blocks have gone. And so we really need to figure out a way to better appreciate, celebrate, and to do repair. And so in my practice, my sort of art practice, my writing practice, I've been trying to explore expressive repair. So, one of the things that makes repair hard is this idea that it has to look exactly like it looked before it got broken. And I'm a bit skeptical of that idea. Like maybe something breaking is an opportunity to make it look a bit different, maybe improve how it looks, which is something that is very common in like Japan, where people will use kintsugi to repair a broken pot with a precious metal, and then sort of the repair is expressed and actually looks really cool. And I think we could apply that same thinking to buildings, to towns, to housing. And so the lamp over there is a paper lamp. It's a Noguchi lamp, but it was like pretty torn apart by a cat. The whole top had come off. And so I repaired it with colourful mulberry paper to try and make a virtue out of the break, like rather than just throwing it away and buying a new one. I was like, okay, how can we turn this into, it's not going to look the same, but it's still going to look cool, and it's still going to express something about me and my attitude. And then I've just been trying to do that to lots of different things. So like the table that was here earlier was repaired in a sort of expressive way. I've got various tools that have been repaired in an expressive way. But it's like I'm trying to move away from thinking as something getting broken as a disaster, like this sort of micro crisis that you were talking about earlier, to thinking of it as an opportunity. That's an opportunity to do something cool, to do something expressive, to make it better in some way.
That's very cool. And on a wider level, you've talked about how the idea of repair can be almost celebrated by the architecture itself. So you gave the example of the Great Mosque in Jenne in Mali.
Oh, yeah.
So tell us about that building, because I'm sure some people would be familiar with it.
Yeah, so in other building traditions, not necessarily in the West, but in other parts of the world, repair already is quite a rich part of construction culture that has expressive and ritual value, as well as being practically useful to just extend the lifespan of your building. And in Mali, there's a particular style of earth construction where you have sort of big sandy earth clay walls that are quite thick, and then they are kind of punctured with chunky bundles of rods that are thick enough that you can stand on them. And so if you look at these buildings, they look kind of like prickly, like a kind of porcupine or something. And they have this very strong aesthetic. It's often used on like mosques or like grand buildings, palaces perhaps. But those rods that you can stand on that are all over the walls are actually sort of built-in scaffolding. So it becomes quite easy for the community or local workers to climb all over these buildings and repair the mud render every year, which you need to every now and then if you've got heavy rains sometimes in the year, and then it's very dry other times in the year. And so it's a way of like not seeing repair as like bad or regrettable, but like part of the life of the building and part of the life of the community. Is like you build the infrastructure to do the repair into the architecture, and you make it part of its aesthetic. And then when you need to do the repair, it's all there, and it's really easy to sort of climb all over this thing and fix it. There's a lot of architects and property developers could learn from that kind of culture.
Definitely. So while we're on materials, Finn, if I'm going to put you on the spot here, but let's imagine that you were building your own house today. Okay.
Whoa.
What materials would you use?
Well, I probably wouldn't build a house from scratch.
I thought you were going to say that. That's why I asked it.
I would try and work with some sort of existing derelict building, which there are a lot of, right? We have, especially in like, I don't know, coastal towns that have been sort of neglected over the years. We have so many vacant buildings, like old chapels in Wales that are falling apart, that could have a second life, or could really need some kind of love and care. I'm a trustee of the 20th Century Society, and every single year we find ourselves fighting against the demolition of not even that old buildings, and frequently they've just not been looked after for long enough that it seems easier to knock them down and start again than to just like work with them or repair them. So my first thought on what the materials of my dream house would be like there'd be something already there. And actually, even this estate, they used reclaimed bricks from the villas that were here before that had been bombs damaged. So this is not a new idea to like work with what you find. But then if I was bringing in new materials, I think I'd be thinking about plant-based materials. So, timber, straw, hemp, and maybe earth. Earth is just like incredibly abundant, incredibly low carbon, and quite good. Like, it's quite good insulator, sort of sticks to itself.
So why aren't we all building with earth?
It's a very interesting question, because we used to, like, back in the day, most buildings would have been made out of plants, like or from earth, and it's only relatively recently that we've started building with like highly processed, high carbon materials like steel and concrete, and even brick, like fired brick, is a relatively modern technology. I think it's partly to do with having a growth-based economy that sees processing as valuable. Like we like to process. We have highly processed foods. People might have read Ultra Processed People, which is this book about the rise of ultra processed foods, like ready meals and things like that. And it's not necessarily because it's cheaper, although sometimes that's the driver. It's almost like we've become reliant on someone else doing the processing somewhere farther up the supply chain. And so we as consumers of food are not doing that ourselves. We're just like shoving something in the microwave or shoving something in the oven, rather than cooking with raw ingredients that take a bit more time in the kitchen to work with. But increasingly, we seem to be becoming aware that like this is really bad for us. This is like driving all sorts of disease and ill health. Is this reliance on ultra processed food as a large part of our diet, and they don't satisfy us. They don't make us feel full. They don't make us feel good. They have addictive qualities at times. And I think there is a parallel you can draw to construction materials. We rely on highly processed construction materials, often prefabricated window components that like come as this complex buildup of silicons and membranes and polymers with like inert gases in, and then we just plug them into a building or clip them into a building. We're not really working with like raw materials in the same way so much. And I think it's a problem. It's a problem for climate because these highly processed materials are much higher impact in terms of the carbon they produce. Like cement alone is 7% of global greenhouse emissions. Steel used in buildings is 8% of global carbon emissions. Like these are big. They're making a big contribution to climate breakdown. And if we could ease our way out of those and explore more plant-based construction practices instead, that would buy us a lot of time on the fighting climate change. But yeah, I think it's a mix of economics and reliance on ultra processing, I think, is driving it. But the good news is there's loads of alternatives available still. We still have the craftsmanship just about to build with straw or thatch a roof. So if people are interested in building their own home or home extension or something, there are people out there who are doing amazing work and are worth tracking down.
So I'd love to sort of finish by bringing it back to this flat. We've talked about rituals in a community sense and your rituals of unlocking and so on. But do you have any kind of personal rituals or routines that you go through in this place at all that kind of give structure to your day?
I try to have one big dinner a month where most people at the dinner don't know each other already. And so you're always meeting new people. And then I'll cook a big meal, I'll make some ice cream, and I'll make a cocktail. And I guess that is a way of, it is a kind of ritual that uses my space that I'm very lucky to have in a way that I think brings joy and connections to other people.
That's fantastic. And you mentioned your mobiles, so they're hanging all around us. But what's the genesis of this? Why did you start making mobiles?
It was originally in a project to sort of commemorate a dead cat, like a pet cat who died. And I hung a little broken dead tree. Well, it was a living tree that got broken that I'd planted to commemorate the cat. I hung it in the flat. And eventually all the leaves fell off it and, it died. But it was really nice having that kind of bit of tree, that little leafy bit of tree hanging in the space. And so when I took the tree down, I thought, I wonder if I can recreate that somehow through an art project. I originally thought I'll buy a mobile. And then I thought maybe I'll make a mobile. And then I've just sort of got carried away. So I've now made, I think, over 300. I've done some huge commissions for, there's one hanging in the LSE. I had one in the Royal Academy. Lots of like smaller private commissions as well. And it's ballooned into a full-on art practice. Which is, I feel enormously lucky to be able to make art as part of how I make a living.
It's really lovely. And I love the tools of your trade that are in the flat here. There's lots and lots of implements. And
I should have a studio or at least use my spare room. But I just find I make them here. Like I make them in this space, in this living room. And that like bashes the floor up a little bit. But there's something very joyful about making art in your own home and then hanging it in your own home and that being part of the practice. Even when I make a piece for someone else, it will have hung in my space for a while before it goes to them. Hopefully that adds some layer to what I'm doing.
Given everything we talked about today, this word home, which is so multifaceted, how would you define it, would you think, that word?
I think I'm still trying to define it, to be honest. I had a very stimulating and interesting childhood, but home was never like a space of comfort or retreat, partly because it was also where I was being taught. It was my school as well as my home, and my parents were quite stressful to live with at times. So I don't have the like super warm, cozy associations with home that some people do. I don't really think home is a fixed thing. I think it's something that we create, and I'm still in the process of creating it, but it's a very stimulating journey. It's also why like being good friends with your neighbours is so good because they're like really present. And if you can build good connections with them that like is a positive that will just like keep giving and giving because you just meet them. It also means if they let you down for some reason, and I had a bit of a fallout with a neighbor recently, hopefully we'll get through it, but like it really hurts much more than if another friend who's more distant geographically had, done something annoying, because they're part of your home, because they are part of your like immediate world, and you feel like quite an intense grief about that, I think, when a neighbor like pisses you off.
Well, that's so true, and it can actually even cause you to change your patterns, can't it? You might come and go at a different time of day, so you don't bump into them, or you might take a different route, or
Exactly, and then that can spiral, and that can become like a really sour, long-lasting animosity. And I'm pretty confident that me and my my neighbor will like get through it.
Come on, neighbor,
we'll make friends again. But yeah, you can see how things that would not deteriorate into long-term conflict with other friends or colleagues can do in the context of a community, because you're just like continuously confronted with each other. And you can respond to that in many ways, but one response is to like sort of tense up. But like the flip side of that, it's still worth it being friends with them, because the flip side of that is if you're on good terms with your neighbors, like every day is reassurance, every day is community, every day is like kindness and affection. And when I was like feeling very, very low, and like the flat was a complete mess, stuff everywhere, some of my neighbors who had a key came in and just tidied it up a bit while I was out. And I came home and I was like, oh, that's weird. Like I can walk to the kitchen without like clambering over stuff. And it's because they just spontaneously like helped me out a little bit. And that's very special. That's not something that I think most people get to experience from their neighborhoods. But that's I will remember that gesture. Probably only took about half an hour, but like I remember that gesture for the rest of my life, I think.
That's amazing. What a nice place to finish on. Yeah, God, I've really enjoyed it, Phin. Thank you so much. And I mean, I haven't said, but the films that you make for the Modern House are fantastic, and people should watch those on the Modern House Instagram account.
Yeah.
But you basically go into interesting buildings and you give your personal take on them, and they're really fascinating, I think. But I've just really enjoyed hearing more about your story. I mean, I think where you've come from, describing growing up on a really kind of bog standard estate is sort of fascinating. I always love that. And then kind of where you've got to, and this feeling of like, you didn't quite feel like you fitted in somehow, but you've really turned that around and made it into a virtue. So I really admire it. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt. Appreciate that.